And I have one more wonderful surprise for you just at the beginning of my third talk. So I'm now going to give you my second talk. I'm working you very hard now this morning. This will be the second reflection. We're going to let the adventure unfold. And the way I see the second one is the adventure into goodness, and see it, and see that story begin to unfold. And of course, the big place where the story unfolds in a very profound way is in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. And so that's what we're going to. But I just love that chance to do the reading from The Horse and His Boy. It's sort of an out-of-sequence novel that Lewis just wanted to write. And it is so marvelous that it's right there in the middle. And the reason I chose that for our first reading is that's where we have somebody meeting Aslan for the very first time. Not prepared to meet him, not warned about it, but there it is. And it is that wonderful experience that is narrated for us in that. And don't you love Lewis's sort of matter-of-fact style of writing? He doesn't pour it on, it's just there. And yet there are these amazing profound theological insights that come through when he says, myself, myself, myself. You know, that's interesting, because earlier on, Shasta said, are you a giant? And notice the answer by Aslan. You may call me a giant, but I'm not like the creatures you call giants. You know, the interesting thing is that the name God in the Hebrew alphabet, in the Hebrew Bible, is Elohim. It's the same as in Arabic, Allah, Elohim. And Elohim is when the God is introduced to us as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's Elohim, Allah. And but when Moses is called by Elohim, by God, to go and rescue the people, he's given another name. And that is, Moses says, who shall I say sent me? Well, he could have said, well, you could say the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob sent you. Instead, at the burning bush, God says, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I am sent you. In other words, Yahweh. That becomes the holy name for God in the Hebrew Bible from then on, Yahweh. And the interesting thing is, that means that God will speak for himself. I will make myself known. And that's interesting that Lewis, in a children's story, decides to show that with just myself, myself, myself. That is actually from the encounter with Moses. Myself, myself, myself. I am. So that's what Moses says to the children. I am has sent me, Yahweh. And so that becomes, in the Bible, the word Lord or the Holy One is Yahweh. It's the holy name for God from then on. But that's just interesting. But notice, you may call me giant. See, God doesn't mind who we call him, but he speaks for himself and makes himself known. And Lewis decides to preserve that. And I think also, I was very touched with the great scene when Aravis is scratched. And Shasta has a sense of justice, and he says, did you scratch her? Why did you scratch her? Obviously, he saw it. And Aslan doesn't lie, so Aslan tells the truth. I did. Well, why? And Aslan says, I tell no one anyone's story but their own. That's right from the Bible, folks. Remember, Peter, in the final scene between our Lord and Peter, Peter says, what about that disciple, John? And our Lord says to him, let him follow me, you follow me. I'm not going to tell you his story. And that's interesting. Peter gets that little mild rebuke. I won't tell you John's story. I'll tell you your story. And so Lewis decides to puts this into a story. It's a fantasy story, but he puts it in and teaches us in a sort of a non-obvious, simple way. But I loved it especially when the boy says, are you a giant? See, that's all he knows. Are you a giant? Well, go ahead. Call me a giant. But I'm not like the creatures you call giants. And then he does identify himself. Well, now I want us to look at the adventure into goodness, because really, I think the encounter that Lewis had with the writings of G.K. Chesterton are so fundamental in when Lewis does become a believer. And we give so much credit to J.R.R. Tolkien for playing that role in that great Addison Walk, where Tolkien and Lewis were talking about myths and all these great fantasy stories that they both loved. And then Tolkien says to Lewis, you know, the eucatastrophe of all time is the birth of Christ. The eucatastrophe, as far as the world is concerned, is the resurrection of Christ, life. He can give life. And then he says, in all of our adventure stories, we have this wonderful sense of breakthrough, or what he calls resolution, or the sudden turn of joy. That's what Tolkien called it. And he says, but in our stories, they're in our imagination, but this is true. And that's why Lewis said the next day, I really think it was that talk from Tolkien that said, the long talk last night with Tolkien and Dyson had much to do with it. I now realize. See, he didn't know what to do with Jesus Christ. Well, Jesus Christ is the eucatastrophe of all time, the good catastrophe. And wow. So then Lewis started to write Christian stuff, and he did it in a way that has left an indelible mark for all of us. And I think when you read the Chronicles of Narnia, always start with The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. And it's true, later one of the books is out of sequence, and that is The Magician's Nephew. I'm going to talk about that in the next hour. But Magician's Nephew is out of sequence, but it tells about the founding of Narnia. But read about it as Lewis portrays it in the way he wrote it, as a flashback for us to see it. But don't start there. Even though the new arrangement of the books has Magician's Nephew as number one, it's not number one. Number one is Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. These children. Okay, Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe is quite interesting because it starts this way. This is how he actually starts the great Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. He said, once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of air raids. By the way, during the air raids, children that were in London, it was so heavily bombed by in one night on September of 1940, the Germans sent 1,000 planes over London to bomb. It was the first time a civilian city was bombed deliberately. And London went through it. And that's why St. Paul's Cathedral always stood, though it was hit 4 times. People say St. Paul's was never hit. It was hit. And BBC was hit, where Lewis did his broadcast talks. And several times it was hit. But the Germans never got it out. They never successfully destroyed it. So anyway, the children were sent away. And the Lewis, wasn't married then. Lewis didn't marry until way into 1955. But Lewis and Mrs. Moore, who lived with him, and of course his brother, a great part until actually his brother was in World War II. You know, his brother Warren was in Dunkirk. He was actually in the Dunkirk rescue. Was Lewis's brother, and then he was discharged from the British Army because he was a major. But he lived with Lewis and then Mrs. Moore, and then they took in children. And I have a little surprise for you in a few minutes about one of those children that Kim Gilnett is my friend, who has some correspondence that Lewis wrote that is very interesting. But at any rate, here is the way the story begins. The story is about something that happened to these children. They were sent to an old professor's house who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station, 2 miles from the nearest post office, and that's the Kilns. That's Lewis's house. He's describing his house because he did have children from London in his house. It wasn't a great mansion like in this story. But at any rate, the children stumble into Narnia through a wardrobe. They're not trying to get into Narnia. In fact, you can't get into Narnia unless you're there by magic. And except when we get to Magician's Nephew, the first to get into Narnia use magic rings that are magic separate, but nowhere else. And we'll save that for the next hour. But right now, they get in because Aslan brings them in. And they get into Narnia, these 4 children. Well, first it's Lucy. Lucy gets in. She meets Tumnus. That's Lewis said that was the first thing that he was thinking of when he wrote that story. It was a fawn walking in the snow with parcels. And the fawn befriends Lucy. What she doesn't realize is, and I think the movie wonderfully captured this, she's befriended by the fawn, but the fawn immediately realizes she's a child of Adam. And they've been alerted by the queen, the Winter Queen, that if any children of Adam and Eve show up, they need to be reported to me, to the secret police, so that she wants to get control of any children from Adam and Eve that might show up. And so he realizes she's a child of Adam and Eve. And so he's about ready to drug her. And remember, in the movie, they did a beautiful job. But then his conscience gets the better of him, and he doesn't do it. But he says, you got to get out of here. So he brings her back to the lamppost, and she goes back in. She says, hey, I'm here, kids. I've been away. And they said, no, where have you been? Time in Narnia doesn't use up any time in England. That's the first rule in his magic. So she, no, where have you been, Lucy? He said, well, didn't you know? Well, she had all this experience. She met Tumnus and all. So finally, there's playing hide and seek another day, and this time with Edmund. She and Edmund were hiding, and they go into this wardrobe, and the kids couldn't believe it. They were wondering if Lucy is something that's crazy about Lucy, because she's talking about seeing snow and everything, and met a fawn and stuff like that. Lucy, they didn't say you've been drinking too much or anything like that. You've been we've been away from the bombing raids too long. I don't know, but they didn't take her seriously. Even though the old professor says you should listen to this kid. Does she usually tell the truth? Listen to her, but they don't do it. So Edmund goes in with her, and then he sees the fawn, but he also has an experience by himself that she's not aware of. And that is, this queen comes by in a sleigh. That was powerfully done in the movie. And the queen sees him, and she, with a sweet voice, she drops a drop of her potion on the snow, and up comes a beautiful Turkish delight candy. This wonderful Turkish delight, and he eats it. It's the most delicious thing he ever ate. He becomes immediately enamored by this amazing woman. She puts him up in the sleigh with him and covers him up with a blanket and says, oh, how wonderful. And do you have brothers or sisters? She said, yeah, I have a brother. He doesn't like his brother. And I have 2 sisters, and they bother me too. He doesn't, but he does say, yeah, I've got them. He says, oh, bring your brother and your sisters to meet me in the castle. I would just love to meet him, and then we'll have lots of Turkish delight. By the way, that Turkish delight is the temptation for this young Edmund, but he never gets another piece of it. Now, that's it. Lewis has a great line: ever-increasing desire for ever-decreasing fulfillment. That's the problem with that kind of addiction. And there's one hit that's wonderful, and then from then on it's to kill pain. There's nothing good afterward. And so he never does get another piece of Turkish delight. But she said, you bring the children to my castle, and I have Turkish delight, much of it for you. Wonderful. And it is marvelous. So he has that experience, and then just suddenly then Lucy shows up and says, oh, I've been looking for you in the snow, because Lucy's so excited that Edmund came in the snow too with her. And then she says, do you know I was with the fawn? And Mr. Tumnus, it says there is this wicked witch here, and she is out to destroy anybody that goes against her will. And she's just awful. She's a terrible, wicked witch. And Edmund is offended by that because he's now enamored with the witch. She gave him Turkish delight. So he is just really miffed at that. Now they come back through the wardrobe, And Edmund does his first act of treachery. The kids say, and Lucy says, hey, we're back. Aren't you excited? And again, no time used up at all in England. And she says, Edmund, tell them about how wonderful it was in the snow and how we met Mr. Tumnus. And then Edmund does this. He says, oh, we were playing games there, but nothing that mattered. And he treats her like a liar, that she has fabricated this whole story. And that's when the professor says, well, now, let's use logic. Which of these two ordinarily is the most truthful? And they say, well, ordinarily Lucy is the most truthful, but she is youngest. And Edmund is kind of always has a little bit of a mean streak. And Peter would say that, because Peter doesn't particularly like Edmund that much anyway. And but anyway, so the professor says, well, you should use logic. You should use logic. So that's how the opening starts. We've already seen this beginning of treachery. And then finally, the kids all, in another game of hide and seek, they all stumble into Narnia. And then, of course, they realize, and they're kind of upset at Edmund, Peter is especially, that he had not taken Lucy seriously. And he said, well, anyway. So they go over to the Tumnus' house and realize it's been ravished. The wolves and the secret police have completely destroyed the house. And that doesn't seem to bother Edmund that much. Lucy is just horrified. Because what the wicked queen does is, as her weaponry, is to turn people into stone. It's interesting, isn't it? Evil that makes its first appearance in the Chronicles of Narnia is seen as cold. It's cold, not hot. It's cold. It's a winter that never ends, and her punishment always is to turn people into stone, and that's a permanent coldness, and that's what she does. So anyway, Edmund is there, but he's already miffed the children, and he realizes that the queen wants him to bring those children to the castle. And he's trying to think of a way to get them over to the castle, because that's what she would want. He misses out because he's now left them looking for where the castle is, because she'd given him a direction of where it would be. And he misses out with the children when they meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. And it's Mr. and Mrs. Beaver that introduce the children to Aslan is on the move. Aslan's coming. And then later, of course, they meet Aslan, but Edmund is not with them. Edmund, in the meantime, has tried to find the castle. He finds the castle. And he sees all kinds of people that have been turned to stone all around him in the castle. And he finds it, but the queen is not happy to see him. She's infuriated at him, and now all the sweetness is gone in the queen. And she then puts a rope around him and puts him behind the sleigh. He doesn't get to ride in the sleigh. And they're going to go look for the children because she's got the secret police out looking for these three children. And that would be the wolves. The wolves are out looking for them. And there's some dramatic scenes where Peter actually has to fight a wolf and kills it because they're coming after them. And Mr. and Mrs. Beaver have now introduced the children to who Aslan is. And then they finally meet Aslan later, and Edmund is not there for all of this. When Aslan meets the children, he says, aren't there four of you? Yeah, but Edmund is gone. He's lost. And we wonder if he's been kidnapped maybe by the wicked queen. And Aslan's, oh, I see. So anyway, what's happened now is that we now revert back to Edmund. And Edmund is now following the sleigh, and the queen has realized that he's failed, and that the children have now come in contact with Aslan, which makes the Winter Queen extremely worried. They've now connected with Aslan, but she's got this worthless boy who there's no more Turkish delight for him. He's now being just whipped by the guy that's following her and driving her sleigh. And another funny thing happens. Remember, everything is so beautiful at the beginning of the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe in the snow, but the snow is now melting and it's getting to be mud. Aslan is on the move, and the first mark of the coming of Aslan is the coming of spring. But that's the worst thing in the world for the queen, because her whole castle is made of ice. And her sleigh won't work now. So now she doesn't even have the sleigh working, and this boy is with her, and she decides, I'm going to just kill him. And she takes his hair, pulls his head back, pulls it up, and she's about to use a dagger and kill him because she's finished with him. At least that'll get one less child of Adam around. And she's about to do it, and then suddenly these amazing animals appear from Narnia, the good animals, centaurs and great horses and stuff like that. And they come, and she hides and turns herself into stone so that they can't see her. And they rescue young, sadder but wiser Edmund. Edmund has realized what he's done, his treachery. And he's realized now that the queen is truly bad. She was about to kill him. And he was spared of that by these wonderful animals from Narnia that came and rescued him, take him back. And that's the scene that I wanted on the cover of your bulletin. It's from the movie, but it's the great Aslan meeting Edmund. Edmund turns out to be a very important character in the rest of the Chronicles of Narnia, too. But Edmund is now totally repentant. He's a repentant, sad, he saw what would happen. He saw how wicked the queen was, and that she really wanted to kill the children. That's why she was about to stab him and kill him. But he was spared so he gets a kind of a partial redemption. He's spared by the rescue. And he's brought back. And so now Edmund meets Aslan. And I tell you, I love this scene because the movie did it beautifully, but it's done beautifully by Lewis in the book. As the children are there resting below because it's now morning. And they look up and they see that Edmund, who had been rescued in the middle of the night, and Aslan are in the grass walking and talking. And you don't have Edmund down on his feet in great prostration. He is not humiliated in his rescue. Oh, man, I've been so bad and everything, and down the... No, Aslan talks to him erect. Karl Barth has a great line that in forgiveness, we realize that with head erect, we meet Jesus Christ. Not bowed down, not humiliated. Humiliation is not it. Notice, no humiliation. He's there. And the kids see him. They know that he's been a traitor. They know all about him. All the animals in Narnia know it. And they know about the rescue. And there he is up there, and he's just talking to Aslan. And I love that was preserved in the movie, that you have this, and that's why I love that picture of the great Aslan talking to this young man. And when the other children woke up the next morning, the first thing they heard was their brother had been rescued, brought into the camp late last night, and that it was at this moment he was with Aslan. As soon as they had breakfast, they went out and they saw Aslan and Edmund walking together in the dewy grass, apart from the rest of the court. There's no need to tell you, I love this from Lewis, there's no need to tell you, and no one ever heard what Aslan was saying. If you've had a real experience with Jesus Christ, other people don't need to know everything that you discovered. You can just be grateful that you had that encounter and grateful for his love, but you don't have to tell him. You don't have to tell him a lot of things. So no one ever heard what Aslan was saying, but it was a conversation which Edmund never forgot. As the others drew nearer, Aslan turned to meet them, and he brought Edmund to him. And I love this great line. "Here is your brother," he said, and there's no need to talk to him about what is past, because they know he's a traitor that was practicing treachery against him. And so they just, and I love it in the book, they just shake hands and say, "Well, how you doing?" And he said, "I'm okay. I'm okay." And that's all. Then suddenly we hear bugle sounds, and the wicked queen asks for safe passage to come and meet Aslan. And so they give her safe passage. She comes because she doesn't have her sleigh anymore. She doesn't have this. Now it's thawed. It's no longer snow. She comes up to Aslan, and she is defiant. And she says, "You have a captive of mine." And then Aslan says, "But he's safe now. We've rescued him." No, he's not safe. Because you know the deep magic that though, now getting a little theology from C.S. Lewis now, those who commit treachery belong to the Lord of treachery. If you've seen any Godfather movie, you know that if you once take money from the mafia, you belong to the mafia. When you do something wrong, if you tell lies, if you do something wrong politically, you belong to the people that you did the lies for. And that is the deep magic, that treachery causes you to lose your freedom to what you bought. You bought political power, you end up belonging to it. Folks, this is so important for us to know in a world like we're living in today. You belong to what you make a deal with. And that's Lewis. Lewis saw it. And he put it in here. And by the way, that truth comes from the wicked queen. She says, you know that those who commit treachery belong to the Lord of treachery. He belongs to me. And they have a long conversation. We don't even hear the conversation between Aslan and the queen, except that Aslan says, I know you want me rather than him, so take me instead of him. And she's, oh, that's a good bargain. That's what I really want. I want you. And that's now the core of this great book. As Aslan is taken by the wicked queen, first he's totally humiliated. He's stripped, he's shaved, he's put on a stone table, tied and bound. And then this is a terrifying scene where, and some people say children shouldn't see this scene, but this is a scene where she, with all her ghouls and everything having won, she takes the knife and she kills Aslan on the stone table and said, now Aslan lies dead. And he is. And on the stone table. And then a strange thing happens. The boys, they knew that something strange had happened, the two boys. Edmund now is a totally repentant young man. So is Peter. But the two girls follow. They follow. And by the way, that's exactly what happened at Mount Calvary. The men did not go to Mount Calvary. The women did. Only one man shows up, and that's John, but he was so young that he could sneak in and no one would know him because he was probably only 16 years old, John. And that's why he does hear from the cross, the Lord saying, behold your mother. Okay. But not Peter, not the others. And so the boys are not there. They're back grieving when they know that Aslan's being led away. The girls follow, and they see this. They see this horror of the death of Aslan. And then they see something else that just worries them so badly. In fact, I'll let Lewis narrate that. I'll let him narrate that scene where they see these little mice coming up to nibble on all the cords. And they say, oh, at one point she says, Susan says, when she sees the mice, she says, ugh, says Susan to the other side of the table, how beastly. There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts. And she raised her hand to frighten them away. Wait, said Lucy, who had been looking even more closely still. Can you see what they're doing? And both girls bent down and stared. I do believe, said Susan, but how queer. They're nibbling away at the cords. And by the way, you know, this is why Aslan honors the mice. The mice are the heroes. They stayed and were doing their best to try to help as best they could this stricken Aslan. And so they watch and they grieve all night. And then in the morning, an amazing thing happens. In the morning, they hear a great crack, an absolute crack. By the way, when one of Lewis's best friends wrote a poem that is on one of the great books called Jack, the Book of Poem. And this man, Don Bay Griffiths, wrote a poem, said, "There'll be a crack, and there's Jack on Aslan's back." That's because there was a crack. The great table was broken. Now, you can, all the symbolism of the law being fulfilled, but the law is fulfilled and broken because here is now the treachery has been handled. One who committed no treachery took it. So anyway, they hear this crack, and then suddenly they see Aslan alive, and he's restored. And then they can't understand it, and so he explains. He has to explain to them what had happened. As they realize, what is it? It's more magic. And then the voice speaks behind them. "Yes," said a great voice in their back. "It's more magic." And they looked around, and there, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan," cried both the children, staring at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. You're not," and Susan was going to say, "You're not a ghost, are you?" She couldn't bear to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head, licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real, Aslan," said Lucy. And the both girls flung themselves on him and covered him with kisses. And they said, "But what does it mean?" And now we get a little theology from Lewis through the two girls. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic," and the deep magic is those who commit treachery belong to the Lord of treachery. "Though she knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time." In other words, in understanding right and wrong, where there is wrong, it does have consequences. That's the whole story of The Godfather, the story of the mafia. You make a deal with the mafia, they own you. They may break your kneecaps if you don't obey them. And they may even kill your children. They control you. So that's the tragedy of evil. When you commit it, you belong to it. And that's the deep magic. And it goes back to the dawn of time. That's what Lewis is saying. But her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked further back, into the stillness and to the darkness before time dawned, she would have read a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack. That would end that kind of solution to the problem. It would crack. See, death belongs to the traitor, but if there is someone who is not a traitor, takes a traitor's place, that breaks the back of judgment. Judgment is now broken. See? It's broken. It's broken by what we call redemption. A new beginning, new life. So he would, if they had known that was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack, and then of course Lewis decides to give his own doctrine of resurrection, and death would itself start working backward. And now there's life. "Oh, yes, now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I'm feeling my strength come back." And so then he has the children jump on him, and they go running around and bring back some of these statues that had been turned to stone. One was Tumnus, by the way, who had been turned to stone. And they have life too. So the life that happens for Edmund is also going to happen for others. And so there is an amazing portrayal in the Chronicles of Narnia of the power of goodness. And that power of goodness is at the very core of the first novel. And then goodness is going to track throughout the novels, too. And we'll see that again when we look in our third talk and see how goodness is going to track in what I call right and wrong, and how the right does heal the wrong, and how wrongness can be resolved. Here we saw the first and most overwhelming portrayal of that amazing goodness and that powerful goodness that happened. And, I kind of love the way The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe closes. It closes after the battle. The queen is now dead, and the children they now realize that there's been this victory, and then suddenly, in the midst of all these rejoicing, Aslan himself quietly slipped away. This is the way Lewis decides to end Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. He quietly slipped away. And when the kings and the queens noticed, now Peter and Lucian, they've been made kings and queens, noticed that he wasn't there, and they said nothing about it. But for Mr. Beaver had warned them, he'll be coming and going. He had said, one day you'll see him and another day you won't. He doesn't like being tied down. And of course he has other countries to attend to. That's from Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know. He's not a tame lion. And that's the way the book is. The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. It ends that way. Now, at this point, I have a guest, and that's Kim Gildan. Would you come up, Kim? Kim and I have done so many C.S. Lewis events in my life, but almost all of my big C.S. Lewis events I've done with this man at Oxford. We've done these Oxford trips. We're not going to do it this year because they're having the Oxbridge experience. But he and I have done that at the Kilns. We stay at the Kilns, and he's my... Kim is from Seattle Pacific University. He's director of admissions there, but he has become an amazing expert on C.S. Lewis. And I consider myself his assistant in doing all these events that we've done together. And I have asked him to tell a story about the fact that Lewis wrote letters. And I want him to tell it.
Thank you. I feel very blessed to be able and honored to be here this morning. And I have been very blessed by my work at SPU. I am not the director of admissions. I'm a senior admissions counselor. I've worked there now for 46 years and been there 4 years as a student, so I'm my 50th year. And I've been blessed to be involved in a Lewis study that started really in the mid-'70s. And so this summer will be, I think, the 30th year that I will have gone and stayed at C.S. Lewis's house, the Kilns, and given tours. And one of the things that I do because of that, I've had an opportunity to spend a fair amount of time studying Lewis's life and how he actually lived out his faith. And to me, that's very, very important. You may remember the Weight of Glory sermon given at St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford in 1941 summer. At the very end, he says, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. That really touched me when I first heard that. And I got a chance to talk to one of Lewis's really close friends, Owen Barfield. And he said when Lewis became a Christian, he deliberately attempted not to think about himself, but think about his neighbor more. And he said what started as a spiritual discipline became a way of life for Lewis. And that's one of the things that I've been amazed in studying Lewis's life. One of the things people always ask me, what is my favorite book of C.S. Lewis? And I have to say, it was one that was not assembled during his lifetime, and it's called the Collected Letters. We have over 4,000 handwritten letters that Lewis wrote to people. Not one of them is a form letter. Every one of them treats that person as if they're sacred. And I wanted to read you one today that touched me greatly. Excuse me, I need these. When Lawrence, a 9-year-old American boy, became concerned that he loved Aslan more than Jesus, his mother wrote to C.S. Lewis in care of the Macmillan Publishing Company. Just 10 days later, to her surprise and delight, she received this answer to her son's questions. May 6, 1955. Dear Mrs. Craig, tell Lawrence from me, with my love, even if he were loving Aslan more than Jesus, and I'll explain in a moment why he can't really be doing that, he would not be an idol worship. If he was an idol worship, he'd be doing it on purpose, whereas now he's only doing it because he can't help doing it and trying very hard not to do it. But God knows quite well how hard we find it to love him more than anyone or anything else, and he won't be angry with us as long as we keep trying, and he will help us. 2, but Lawrence can't really love Aslan more than Jesus, because even if he feels that's what he's doing. For the things he loves Aslan for doing and saying are simply the things Jesus really did and really said. And he is loving Jesus and perhaps loving him more than ever he did before. Of course, there's one thing Aslan has that Jesus has not. I mean, the body of a lion. But remember, if there were other worlds and they needed to be saved and Christ were to save them, as he would, he may really have taken all sorts of bodies in them, which we don't even know about. Now, if Lawrence is bothered because he finds the lion's body seems nicer to him than man's body, I don't think he need to be bothered about that at all. God knows all about the way little boys' imaginations work. He made it, after all, and knows at a certain age the idea of a talking and friendly animal is very attractive. So I don't think he minds if Lawrence likes the lion's body. And anyway, Lawrence will find, as he grows older, that feeling, liking the lion body better, will die away of itself, without his taking any trouble about it, so I don't think he need bother. 3, if I were Lawrence, I'd just say in my prayers something like this. Dear God, if the things I've been thinking and feeling about those books are things you don't like and are bad for me, please take away the feelings and thoughts. But if they are not bad, then please stop me from worrying about them and help me every day to love you more in a way that really matters, far more than feelings or imaginations, by doing what you want and growing more like you. That's the sort of thing I think Lawrence should say of himself, but it would be kind and Christian-like if he then added, and if Mr. Lewis has worried any other children by his books or done them any harm, please forgive him and help him to never do it again. Will this help? I am terribly sorry to have caused such trouble and take great favor if you would write again and tell me how Lawrence goes on. I shall, of course, have him daily in my prayers. He must be a corker of a boy. I hope you're prepared the possibility he might turn out to be a saint. I dare say saints' mothers have in some ways a rough time. Yours sincerely, C.S. Lewis. I have been privileged to give hundreds, if not thousands, of tours to the kilns to people. And I remember one day I was giving a tour to 6 and 7-year-olds from St. Andrew's School in Headington. And so I'm giving the tour, and as occasionally will happen, you'll have people join out the end of the tour. So I finished the tour. By the way, you've got to be really careful when you give tours to children because they know better than you the stories. They knew better than Lewis or Tolkien did, actually. But anyway, so I finished this tour, and I go out in front of the kilns, and I introduce myself. Hi, I'm Kim Gilnet. And he says, hi, I'm Lawrence. It's this Lawrence. I immediately asked him, I said, did you turn out to be a saint? He looked at his wife sheepishly and said, no, but I'm much more of a saint I would have been if Lewis hadn't written to me. And he sent me all of the correspondence, and I had a great opportunity to realize that these are real stories. Lewis was an amazing man, and his faith guided his life, and I've been very privileged to be involved. Thank you.
You know, Tim, do you have the Freud letter? You know, Tim and I, we do these events in Oxford, and this last year he told us about Lawrence. But there's another one that is totally moving that I'd like you to do it. And one person that was a child sent to live in Oxford during the war was a girl named Jill Freud. She ended up marrying a person that ended up in Parliament.
Yes.
And anyway, she wrote a letter about what it was like living in the house when Lewis was there. And just, you know, some of those excerpts are so marvelous.
They are. And Jill Fluitt was her name, Jill Freud. She actually married a relative of Freud. And she's still alive in London. And she came to live with them during the war. And she became a favorite of Warnie and of Lewis's. And this is what she said about it. You can imagine that day-to-day conversation with a man of a first-class brain and a tremendous education, a teacher whose mind was on literature, theology, and critical arguments, that such conversation was a much higher level than I'd ever participated in before. Just to sit quietly and listen was an education. I went to the kilns with no opinion whatever of my intellectual ability. Lewis was the first person who made me believe that I was an intelligent human being, and the whole time I was there, he built up my confidence in myself and in my ability to think and to understand. He never put me down. He never made me feel foolish, no matter how small my contribution towards any conversation might be. If he thought I said something particularly silly, the most he would do was refrain from answering. He might perhaps ignore something I said. I left the kilns with a deep understanding, with a belief that I was of value. And he did the same for others too. For some months, I had a young man living at the kilns. He worked as a houseboy and a general helper. He was probably introduced by the social services department, and he was what we would call now educationally subnormal. He had the mentality of a child of 8. Every evening, Jack Lewis taught him to read. Lewis made drawings and letter cards for him. He went through the alphabet with him and tried to teach him small words and so on. I don't think he had a great deal of success because the young man found it hard to retain anything. But for more than 2 months, Jack Lewis went through the alphabet with him every evening. Here you have one of the incredible scholars, and I don't think it's easy for us as Americans to understand how education in England is such a part of stature and life. Professors are the highest. You know, Lewis tended to get criticized because he would be communicating with the masses. Well, that was Lewis. Lewis believed that every person was sacred. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Thank you.